Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jim Turk, and I'm the director of the Center for Free Expression at Ryerson University. And I'd like to welcome you to today's panel. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which I am welcoming you today is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and now is home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. I also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaty, signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. Today's panel discussion is the ninth and the final in the Spring Center for Free Expression weekly virtual forum series. The series will resume in September, and the topics for September will be on our website, which is cfe.ryerson.ca. The topic today deals with Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram and other digital platforms. And the title is Platforms of Distortion, Can They Be Fixed? I want to thank PEN Canada, which is co-sponsoring today's panel. The format for today's discussion is that shortly I'm going to be introducing the panelists, whom you will see as they are introduced. After about 45 minutes or so, I'll turn to you, the audience, for questions. If you'd like to ask a question, at any point, if you look down at the bottom of your screen, move your cursor down toward the bottom center of your screen, you'll see a Q&A button. And just click on that and write out your question that you would like to address to either an individual member of the panel or the panel as a whole. And you can do that at any time from the start of the panel discussion. And when we get to that section, I'll turn to Ange Holmes, the center's coordinator, and ask her to read the first question, and we'll go through the questions and have the panel discuss them with you. This panel discussion is being video recorded, and a video podcast of it will be posted on the center's web page tomorrow. And you'll be able to see it. You can either click on podcasts, or you can go to the website's events page and find the event, and the podcast will be there. And again, the center's website address is cfe.ryerson.ca. I'd like to express my appreciation to Ange Holmes, who I mentioned previously, who's the center's coordinator and does so much of the work that makes these panel discussions possible. I'd also like to thank Brian Bowes and Luke Nader from Ryerson University's Media Services, whose technical expertise has been and continues to be invaluable to us. And now for today's panelists. Our panelists are, the first panelist I'd like to introduce is Matt Bailey. Matt serves as PEN America's Digital Freedom Program Director, focusing on issues ranging from surveillance and disinformation to digital inclusion that affects journalists and writers around the world. Previously, Matt served as a senior advisor for the National Democratic Institute. Before that, he was a civil servant in the office of the United States Chief Information Officer under two presidents. While at the White House, Matt was part of the teams that launched the first ever US government-wide open source and legislative data initiatives, led its participation in the Open Government Partnership, and led the Chief Information Officer's policy team. Matt has also served the city of Washington, D.C. as its first director of technology innovation, launching initiatives to increase civic engagement, adoption of modern software practices, and human-centered design. He was an early employee of the U.S. Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, where he worked to bridge the agency's open data and service design strategies. He has also served as a cybersecurity engineer and analyst, a software developer, and was a founder of the Code for DC, an affiliate of Code for America. Matt holds an MA in English Literature from Georgetown University. Welcome, Matt. Our second panelist is Brendan de Caires. Brendan is the executive director of PEN Canada, which defends freedom of expression as a basic human right in Canada and internationally, helps free persecuted writers from prison, and assists exiled writers who live in Canada. Brendan has headed PEN Canada's programs and special projects for a decade, editing and co-authoring country studies of Mexico, Honduras, India, and Guatemala. In 2013, following publication of Honduras, Journalism in the Shadow of Impunity. He joined a Penn delegation to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights in Washington, D.C. for a special session on impunity in Honduras. In 2017, after collaborating on Penn International's Universal Periodic Review of Freedom of Expression in Guatemala, he coordinated a week-long security training workshop for 16 indigenous female journalists in Guatemala City. Born and raised in Georgetown, Guyana, Brendan attended Stonyhurst College in Lancashire and read English literature read English language and literature at the University of Oxford. He has worked as an editor in newspaper, trade, and magazine publishing, and as a book reviewer for publications in Canada, the United States, and the Caribbean. Welcome, Brendan. Our third panelist is Petra Molnr. Petra is the acting director of the International Human Rights Program at the University of Toronto Faculty of Law. She has worked on forced immigration and refugee issues since 2008 as a settlement worker, researcher, and lawyer. Petra regularly shares her work domestically and internationally and specializes in immigration detention, health and human rights, gender-based violence, and the politics of refugee, immigration, and international law. She is currently exploring the human rights impacts of automated decision-making and artificial intelligence in Canada's immigration and refugee system in a joint project with the Citizen Lab. Petra articled at the Barbara Schleifer Commemorative Clinic, which works with women who have experienced violence, and is on the executive of the committee of the Canadian Association for the Study of Forced Migration. Welcome, Petra. I'm so happy to see all of you, and I'd like to situate our discussion by actually starting with a quote from a really interesting book by Roger McNamee titled Zucked. It's about Facebook. McNamee was one of the earliest investors in Facebook and had an ongoing relationship with Mark Zuckerberg for some period of time. I suspect it's strained now because his book, which I highly recommend, entitled Zucked, is anything but complimentary. But anyways, he has a statement in the beginning of his book that I think helps situate our discussion today. And it's about the context for the discussion. He writes, beginning with television, technology has changed the way we engage with society, substituting passive consumption of content and ideas for civic engagement, digital communication for conversation. Sadly, subtly, and persistently, it has contributed to our conversion from citizens to consumers. Being a citizen is an active state. Being a consumer is passive. A transformation that crept along for 50 years, accelerated dramatically with the introduction of internet platforms. We have been prepared to enjoy the benefits, but unprepared for the dark side. Unfortunately, the same can be said for the Silicon Valley leaders whose innovations made the transformation possible. So with that brief context, what I'd like to start by asking Matt an opening question. When we're talking about platforms, what are we referring to by the term platforms, and what's unique about them, and what makes them unlike earlier modes of communication of content?
Yeah, well, it's a really complex question, and I'm sure all of us have a take on it. I think, it's really easy to get caught up in the technology in these discussions, and kind of fun to think about it if you're me. But I think one of the best things to do is take a step back and ask what these systems do. What do they enable the people on kind of the citizen side and on the corporate side to do as very powerful tools? And in that context, I think it's really useful to think about this line that everybody will have heard at some point, kind of floating around out there in a news article or in your feed. This idea of better ads, that people want better ads or more useful advertisements. And it's just a really, really interesting thing. I mean, my gut reaction, I don't know about other people's, is I don't know that I want any ads. I'm not really sure what a better ad is other than maybe a news article. But it really gets to the heart of kind of what the platforms are designed to do really, really well. So to that question of what do they enable people to do, For users, they allow us to do a lot. And I think it's really important not to lose sight of that. You can do a lot of things on Facebook or on Twitter that you can't do on your television. You can get news, you can connect with family, you can shop, you can advocate, you can take radical political positions that are heard around the world in ways that you never could have done 50 years ago. You can speak out however you want to, artistically, otherwise, and you can protest. Facebook is probably the most common, not to say best, community organizing tool the world's ever known. But for the companies, what it really allows them to do is predict user behavior. These are giant prediction machines. What does that mean? And we'll get back to ads in a moment, but hopefully you can start to see the connection already. What it means is anytime you're using Facebook, you're using one of these platforms, you're speaking, you're shopping, you're taking actions, you're rating a product and speaking your mind about how terrible that thing was you bought on Amazon 2 weeks ago. You're not only doing the thing that you're doing, speaking, being a citizen, you're also generating a massive amount of data about what you do and what people like yourself do. All of that data is fed into increasingly sophisticated tools. You'll hear AI, machine learning, that are all designed essentially to mathematically model what you and people like yourself are likely to do in the future. Sometimes I talk about this as it's almost like an 8-bit avatar of yourself. And as more data becomes available, it's like a Super Nintendo avatar. It's coming into crisper and crisper definition. And at some point, and I think we're at that moment, it starts to look creepily kind of just like you. Like it kind of acts just like you would act. And so what these avatars with these sort of models, machine learning models, are able to do is increasingly accurately predict the types of things, for example, you might click on if you saw it in an advertisement, the types of articles in your news feed that you might find compelling and that would cause you to keep reading more and dwell on the website for longer. Or in more disturbing cases, and I'm sure Petra will get to this, predict who's a good target for law enforcement, who's a good person to be bequeathed with citizenship as a refugee, et cetera. So what you have is you have this massive apparatus. Sometimes it's discrete. Sometimes these databases that are being generated are separate from one another for corporate reasons or legal reasons. And sometimes it's linked. The data is being pooled and connected in really interesting and strange ways. That's all designed to be able to predict what people as individuals and as communities in aggregate are likely to do in the future and to take action on it. So when we talk about better ads, I find that very revealing because, of course, we know that Google, Facebook in particular, but other companies as well, are essentially advertising companies. That's where their money comes from. So they have a business model that is incented to gather as much data about you as possible, about all of us as possible, and feed that into these avatar generating AI tools to make better and better predictions on ever more and more surveillance data. They're giant surveillance machines. I'll hand it off because I think there's a lot to digest there. But when you start thinking about these companies as not just a website or a communication tool, and you start thinking about them as data aggregators, greedy collectors of information to make predictions about the future, it starts to make some of the business decisions we see from the large companies a little less random. Why did Google buy Nest, and why do they want to link your Gmail account to your home thermostat? Why does Facebook track people across the web even when you're logged out or even if you don't have a Facebook account? It's in order to feed that massive data infrastructure layer that then they can use to make predictions, can use to sell ever better and more effective advertising, and ... all of the other things that we're worried about today.
Thank you, Matt. Brendan, could you elaborate perhaps? There's been no end of commentary. I mentioned McNamee's book, there are lots of others. No end of commentary about these platforms and their problems. Could you elaborate a little bit more on what you see to be the main problems that they cause for us individually and for us as a society?
I think there's a simultaneous confluence of problems. In the last 15 years in America, 2,000 newspapers have folded, and that space has been occupied by digital media companies. There were 525 3 years ago. There are 525 today, so they're not expanding. And it's important to see what happens when you shift over to digital, when you hand over the distribution of news into digital companies, which then in turn pass it on to social media platforms. So basic things start to change. A good rule of journalism, I heard Caires say this the other day, is that you should believe what you see and don't see what you believe. And the way that digital platforms are structured is that the avatar that Matt was just describing increasingly delivers to you what you believe. And we're increasingly creating readership that has a frictionless experience of the world. So we are getting used to consuming information that has been published but not checked. We are receiving it from people who have no liability as publishers. We are getting it through global distribution systems, which means that local information, the sort of information that keeps politicians honest, that keeps people engaged in voting, is increasingly disappearing. We're receiving this information through platforms that are watching us far more carefully than we are watching them. And that we are handing over our personal political information to prediction machines that have an unprecedented capacity to manipulate us. So that if you look at, we discussed this earlier, this re-election campaign for Barack Obama, it was extremely sophisticated in reading data and knowing exactly where to push the vote. And at the time, that was hailed as a breakthrough of wonderful, innovative use of big data. But it didn't look quite so good in 2016 when the Trump people leveraged Facebook to achieve a far more spectacular result. So the problem is that we're handing over our news gathering and consumption and distribution of news to black boxes, to companies that have proprietary algorithms that control the way we receive this news in completely untransparent practices. And the results are everywhere to see.
I mean, you were commenting on what's happened in the United States. April Lindgren at the Ryerson School of Journalism has a local news project, local news research project, which any of our listeners can Google, which shows a similar kind of thing that's been dramatically increased during the pandemic. 50 community newspapers have closed. And prior to that, 29 newspapers and magazines had canceled some or all of their print editions. I think she said that 82 media organizations have announced layoffs, and that over 2,000 editorial and non-editorial workers in the media industry have lost their jobs. So, I mean, we're really seeing the impact of exactly what you've described. Petra, I'd like to turn to you. Could you give us some more specific sense of how these issues play out from your own work with immigrant communities and with refugees?
Great, thank you so much, Jim and Ange, for having me today. I'd like to start off by just bringing in some of the perspectives from the work that I do. And one of the main ideas really that I want to start off with is that technologies are not experienced equally. And in fact, the more we delve into it, the more we realize just how much difference there is when it comes to both the way we interact with technologies, but also the way we are affected by them. And context really does matter. Context matters geopolitically, given where we are looking at things from and what kind of broader linkages we want to make. The creeping influence of the private sector, like my previous panelists already alluded to, and also the kind of public-private partnerships that we will hopefully unpack in this discussion. But in my work, I'm situated kind of at the intersection of human rights, immigration, and technology. And when we're looking at, for example, the rising xenophobia across the world, rising anti-migrant sentiments, this all really plays into how our understanding of decision-making and new tools of surveillance and platforms of disinformation are coming into play. So, for example, in my work, I'm trying to get a better understanding of how new technologies like AI and automated decision-making are impacting people's lives and human rights. And you can look at it from a variety of perspectives, whether you want to use international human rights law or try and understand it from a Canadian perspective using the Charter, for example. But a broad host of rights is affected when people start engaging with platforms like this, but then also when data is collected about them. So for example, in the immigration context, your online behavior might be used to populate an automated decision-making system that will then spit out a risk score about you based on really dubious characteristics that are difficult to understand. But this kind of black box thinking really has far-reaching ramifications on, for example, your application to immigrate to Canada, your ability to apply for refugee protection or be seen as a so-called risk. This risk categorization that we're seeing is not only inherent in immigration, but it's also something that is talked a lot about, for example, in predictive policing and in the criminal justice sector. And all of these decisions rely on data. But the question is, where does this data come from? How is it collected? And how do we as human beings moving through the world understand what happens to the information that is collected about us? And these new platforms really are challenging our understanding, for example, of what counts as a reasonable decision maker. Who gets to make decisions about our lives in these really far-reaching ways? And what counts as a reasonable decision? And how do we challenge it when something goes wrong? If, for example, you are denied entry into Canada based on something you liked on Facebook, what can you do about that? What does transparency look like when more and more decisions are made in these black boxes? In my work, I try and foreground the experiences of marginalized communities that are not normally part of the conversation. In my case, it's mostly refugees and immigrants, but it's also important to look at the differential impact of technology on women and people escaping domestic violence, for example, racialized communities, people on welfare, and how really this space is becoming co-opted by private interests in this kind of surveillance capitalism that we're increasingly seeing. And I'll end just with saying that, I'm hoping that in this discussion, we can also try and unpack some of these more philosophical questions around world building, really, because this is what we're talking about. Who gets to participate meaningfully in these conversations of what kind of world we want to build? And we now find ourselves in this pandemic reality where that, I think, is something that we also need to think about. How will this pandemic accelerate some of these worrying trends that we are all seeing in our work?
Thank you, Petra. You were illustrating how these are used in decisions about who can immigrate or who gets refugee status. Brendan or Matt, do you see other examples? What comes to mind is people applying for jobs. Suddenly the same kind of process, black box AI process can go on where,
Yeah, I would say, it's again, sort of technology tends to get mystified in a way, get mythologized, and I think that the boundaries of which systems include or don't include AI or these types of algorithmic decision-making processes is actually not categorical, meaning certainly some firms like Palantir are specialized in doing very sophisticated versions of this type of reasoning. But at least in the States, and from my experience in a few different kind of layers of our bureaucracy, aspects of this type of technology and this type of decision-making, whether direct or by consuming knowledge that's coming from systems run by third parties, is ubiquitous. It's not all equally effective. It's not all equally well understood or transparent or black box, but this is not something that we have a moment here where we can get in front of it, stop and think about whether it's a good idea or not, and then decide whether to proceed. It's already inside the building. One discourse that we've had a lot recently, given the protests over George Floyd's murder in the States, is around the appropriateness of facial recognition technology in use by police departments. I'm not going to go super deep into that because I think it's a little off topic for today. But one of the really interesting / terrifying things that we see about it is that this is not necessarily like departments buying best-in-class facial recognition technology and then using it internally and developing internal expertise. this is a closed, poorly understood vendor ecosystem, and police departments, when they're using facial recognition, are essentially just buying it off the shelf the way that any of us buy any service off the shelf. These are like almost like consumer style tools that they're using. And most recently, there was the case in Detroit of a gentleman being arrested, essentially racially profiled by facial recognition technology. And there was a quote, I haven't verified it myself, but it rings true that the tool they're using is known to be 97 to 99% high false positive rate. So the questions that we're talking about here are incredibly present. They sort of have a good way of rendering themselves invisible because they tend to disproportionately impact the people who are already politically dispossessed. And the ethical issues and the technical issues that are confronting us are very, very, very important and fraught.
Brendan, you've done a lot of work internationally. Do you have some examples, or can you talk a little bit about how Facebook is used by various regimes around the world, not in a liberatory sense, but in a controlling way?
Well, listening to what Matt was just saying, there's this wonderful quote by the English drama critic Kenneth Tynan, who was producing a play about hell, and he scribbled in his notes that the characterizing feature of hell is not that it's immoral, but that it has no standards at all. It cannot criticize or judge, it can merely like or dislike. And it's a wonderful description, I think, of what the problem has been, that we have taken a public sphere that was meant to examine and criticize, if you look at the Habermasian ideal, and we've handed it over into what is essentially a sort of child's play. And the consequences have been quite predictable. Now, as Matt was saying, the technology does get mystified, and it's not some evil thing. It is optimized. When engineers talk about using a system, they optimize it for something. And what happened is that what used to be called the data exhaust, and was then turned into behavioral surplus, this is the money spinner. So the platforms, because they watch you so carefully, they know what to serve you. And this increasingly pushes you off into filter bubbles and makes you completely irreconcilable to your enemies. So if you want to look at the consequences of Facebook, a very obvious one would be a simple, nobody that I knew on my Facebook feed voted for Brexit. So when it came through, it seemed like a bolt from the blue. But everyone that I then met who voted for Brexit, everyone on their feed was voting for Brexit. So that is a very simple thing. And if you multiply that effect across the world, you're optimizing for dissent. So everyone is talking to each other, and there's this effect that it pushes you to occupy more and more extreme positions. And is it Godwin's law, where you invoke Hitler after 5 minutes of disagreement? We're putting people onto platforms that incent this sort of behavior. So we can't then be surprised when we all end up in fragments that are quarreling. There's a lovely quote, Senator Moynihan, everyone is entitled to his own opinion, but not his own facts. Well, we've handed over to a system that is doing exactly that. It's giving everyone their own set of facts.
One of the other issues that comes up a lot is about how these platforms can spread disinformation. That in fact it's very difficult on using the platforms to tell what's information and what's disinformation. Is this an issue that you've thought about and experienced in some ways or other?
I can answer that, but I'm sure all of us could answer that.
I mean, I was thinking of people from Penn, I mean.
Oh, well, of course there are a variety of harms that accrue from this. So for example, you can tweet that somebody has just eaten beef in India and a mob will descend and kill them, which has happened on more than one occasion. You have weaponized information. So there is a crucial distinction, of course. There's disinformation, which is fed deliberately into the system to polarize, which the Russians have done very effectively in America. And then there's misinformation, which is, of course, unwittingly bad information that's spread unwittingly. But I think that this is where the point about the automation of the process matters, because you have these vast platforms and the algorithms are sifting through to see what is it that keeps people on the device the longest. And the simple answer to that is fear, hatred, all the negative emotions. So the system invisibly is leaning into bad news. At a very basic level, on Instagram and Facebook, people have discovered that you look at photographs of your ex having fun with someone else. So that's a sort of negative emotion that is being pressed by the algorithm. If you turn it into something much more serious, like political differences, racial differences, religious differences, then it's a time bomb. And Facebook know this, and they've known it for quite a while. And the antidote to that is, of course, to revert to the former publishing model, where you check sources, you verify information, you think about its effects before you publish. But this is not their model, and they have engaged in regulatory capture to prevent them being held responsible in this way. So I think that's part of the answer to the question.
I mean, Petra, in your own work, I mean, you must see examples of social media being used to vilify immigrants and refugees, a lot of what would be called hateful speech and misrepresentation and disinformation and misinformation as applied. Is that I mean, to what extent is that something you're seeing, and to what extent are the platforms responsible for the perpetuation of that?
Definitely, it's something that we're seeing and tracking quite closely, because I mean, the kind of discourse around migration is always polarized, but now it seems like with these platforms, there's this acceleration of the vitriol that is really easy to kind of throw at communities that sometimes don't have an opportunity to respond. Mm-hmm. And not only is that problematic in terms of, you know, obviously hate speech and then all that brings with it, but also the concern is that it shifts certain political considerations when it comes to sensitive issues like border policy, like immigration, also things like funding for contentious issues that we are grappling with as a society. And I mean, I guess the other issue is that it doesn't really allow us to really parse and problematize a lot of the assumptions that go into you know, the kind of decisions that are made online, and then who gets to participate in pushing certain conversations forward. It's one thing to have a public forum and have a discussion in person, but when a lot of this happens online, and then it's then fed into policymaking that is used to justify, for example, increased surveillance of racialized communities, increasingly draconian border enforcement. Now under COVID, you know, all sorts of different health tracking apps are out there as well that are using the data that's online. I mean, I think it's the lack of transparency and the lack of understanding of just how far-reaching a lot of these discussions are that we really need to parse out.
Well, I want to turn to what we can do about this. And that was part of the title for today's. But are there any other problems or aspects of it that anyone of you would like to comment on briefly before we talk about what are some possible solutions?
I'd just like to pick up briefly on what Petra was talking about. I think if you read Desmond Cole's reporting on the carding database in Ontario, it's very, very relevant to this, which is that once people gather a database, they never let go of it. So that database was originally gathered in the summer of the gun, when there was all this gun crime and this surveillance was there to protect us. But then 10 years later, when there was practically no gun crime, it was still retained. And it was there for all sorts of nefarious purposes. And all we have is the promise of officials who, shall we say, do not rank very high in the trust index. And we are meant to accept that they'll use this responsibly. Now, if you look at the record of Facebook, Google, Twitter, all of them, they have shared the information recklessly. They've exploited it in a million different ways. So there's very little on our side, on the consumer side, the user side, to make us confident that they will use it more responsibly in the future. So to segue into part of what might be the answer, I think that Matt will be able to explain this much better than I will. Transparency, data, algorithmic transparency, how are they processing this data? How are these decisions made? Some of this is proprietary, so they'll be quite reluctant to release it. But I think data portability is the one that I'm really interested in.
Well, before going to that one, let's just go to Matt around algorithmic transparency. I mean, these are, as Petra was describing, effectively black boxes. And we saw when Facebook changed its algorithm in a way that privileged certain kinds of media content and not others, all sorts of small magazines and so on suddenly got a lot more ad revenue. And then 2 years later, they changed it again and their revenue plummeted markedly. And yet it's absolutely invisible. Could you comment just a little bit more on algorithmic transparency and what might be done in that regard?
Yeah, small question.
Yes.
I mean, and notably, it's a good moment to be talking about it because there was an announcement from Facebook today. I put it in my little notepad so I wouldn't get it wrong, but that they're going to start updating the way that they're prioritizing news stories in the news feed. So not in the main feed, but the news feed, to try to prioritize original reporting, and with attributed authorship. And I think probably also in there, because they've been talking about it recently, more recent news stories. So there's been kind of a disinformation technique of recirculating old stories, like repackaging old tragedies or incidents of violence as if they're happening in the current moment, because of that sort of like almost veracity. So, and broadly while I'm on it, one of the really interesting and I think overall positive developments recently from the platforms, this doesn't quite get to algorithmic transparency, but is to start trying to look at ways to avoid deleting content, to preserve the existence of speech, but to nudge people using changes like this, either in how they're prioritizing content or in how they're warning people about the quality of content, to try to kind of slow the accelerated rate of disinformation propagating through the systems. So there's really interesting work happening here. On the question of algorithmic transparency, there's not sort of one way that it works, and I'm also not quite the right person to talk about it. But an algorithm can be something as simple as a yes or no. If the light is red in the United States, if the light is red, stop. If the light is green, proceed. That's an algorithm. An algorithm can also be something that's incredibly complex and ultimately that's like querying derivative data that's not really sure what you're not really sure what the provenance of it is, what's the internal logic of it. And so the question of how do you actually, from an engineering standpoint, implement true transparency into systems that are aggregating terabytes and terabytes of data and then driving derivative insights from it is not actually very obvious. I hesitate to say this sort of thing because it's also kind of in the interest of a lot of these companies to say that because it forestalls regulation, but it's nonetheless true. I think that one of the more interesting things that I've run into recently is the idea of algorithmic audits. So if you have the black box, not asking so much how exactly is it all wired up inside of the box, but asking how racist is the box and how it acts. And so for people who haven't run into it, gender shades is a really, really, really interesting and very accessible for non-technologists, non-data scientists entry in this field. It showed that in the facial recognition tools from many of the most prominent vendors, IBM and the rest, that there was massive differential in the accuracy of their facial recognition tools, showing double-digit differentials in accuracy between like lighter skinned men and darker skinned women, for example. So they studied it not only on a question of race or gender, but actually intersectionally, and showed that at that intersection, it's actually even more worse. And that's the sort of issue that we're talking about. So when we talk about algorithmic transparency, it's a big, loaded, complex term, but I think what it really just signifies, I have a history in open government and demanding transparency as an anti-corruption stance, as a civic participation stance facing a government. And I think that what algorithmic transparency starts to do is try to figure out how would we port that into the private sector in these systems that are sort of have become middleware for our democracy, have kind of become the equivalent of a public forum that is actually an intermediary run by private interests. How do we insert ourselves into that in a way that respects corporate business interests and the need for privacy and how they're running their operations, but also allows us to have opinions about whether these systems are actually good or not, and doesn't force us to rely on their sort of good faith.
I mean, I really I'm sorry, go ahead, Petra.
Sorry, I was just going to add, I mean, in terms of the conversations around transparency, what Matt alluded to, I think it's also important to push the conversation further and look at accountability and how to actually challenge these decisions. It's one thing to try and understand how they work, but then when a mistake is made, what do we do? And from a legal perspective, this is really complicated, particularly when we start moving into an area where there are a lot of public-private partnerships, where the private sector is developing technology for the use of in the public sector, so for administrative decision-making and immigration, welfare, all sorts of other things. And let's say there's a huge mistake made on your file and you want to challenge that in a court of law. Right now, it's unclear how you would even go about doing it and who is actually the responsible party. Is it the designer that designs the algorithm? Is it the coder? Is it, let's say in my case, right, the immigration officer that uses it? Is it the algorithm itself? Should an algorithm have legal personality? I mean, these are questions that we're going to have to start asking ourselves as more and more mistakes get made.
Mm-hmm.
Jim, if I can just jump in with one little
Sure.
anecdote from Merchants of Truth, Jill Abramson's book on how the new digital platforms have affected the news media. She cites Jonah Peretti, who was the sort of lead figure for a lot of this stuff at BuzzFeed. And they created these psychographic profiles using all the data. And they discovered that in a sort of Pareto principle way, that there were super spreaders of information. And it's rather perfect. The psychographic profile that was the most productive was the type that they identified as histrionic narcissists. And if you think that your algorithm is privileging a histrionic narcissist over everyone else, is it any surprise that we have what is effectively a Twitter troll as the president of the United States? I mean, he is perfectly suited to the technology, and they actually have the analysis to show it. So that's the sort of thing I'm talking about at a very basic level when you're looking at algorithms. Should it really be amplifying a message from a histrionic narcissist? Probably not.
I mean, that's why I liked the suggestion, Matt, you were making in terms of algorithmic audits. I think the quest to get inside the black box, given the complexity of it, I think often it's hard to, by even the people who've created it, to know the full range of what it does. So looking at what the impact of it is, which is measurable, may be a way to go. And I don't know if some people have written about it, or there are any suggestions you could make for our audience where they could find anything more about algorithmic audits as a possible way of dealing with part of this.
I'm looking for sources myself. I'm just a student right now, but I just find the idea very compelling personally. Yep. Yeah. I mean, I would say, look, even on this question, I assume at some point we're going to turn to filter bubbles as well.
Yes.
And, talking about filter bubbles, this idea that the algorithm knows the stuff you're interested in, and so they just send you more stuff that's like the stuff that you already looked at. And so your world goes from as big as the world on Google to smaller and smaller, and pretty soon you're in a little fish tank submarine helmet. What's really interesting about that is it sort of makes sense intuitively, but there've been a number of studies. There's a Reuters study, or well, there's a recent study that I was just reading that actually start to trouble that idea and complexify it. And I think that's the type of move that we have to make, including with algorithmic bias, is not to say like, is there a filter bubble or is there not, but in what ways are tools helpful and simultaneously hurting? Like, we have to increase the overall sophistication of essentially the electorate of all of us outside of academia, outside of technical silos, to really talk about the pluses and minuses, and also to understand that it's deeply non-uniform across different algorithms or across different tools. To the extent that, I don't know, to the extent that Google's main search engine is racist, I don't know the answer to that question. But if it is, it's certainly racist in different ways or with a different texture from Facebook's newsfeed, just to pick two big players. So, you know, the study was talking about filter bubbles and said, like, look, the conditions are right for this, but what we're finding is that it appears that people who get their news online get more polarized, but at the same time, they have a higher diversity of news sources. So, like, that's very, very interesting to me. Again, I haven't sort of gone back and replicated the research, and I'm sure there's other findings out there that contradict that. But that idea of like, there's actually multiple pushes and pulls that are happening, that's the type of conversation that I think we need to be having. And that starts to approach kind of the promise of algorithmic transparency, even though it kind of comes at it from a different direction.
Brendan, I had interrupted you to come back to algorithmic transparency when you were raising data portability. I'd like to interrupt you for one more minute. Petra had talked about you know, the harm that's often done to immigrants and to refugees, and there's hate speech and hateful speech. And there are increasingly calls for Facebook and for Twitter to deal with that hateful speech. And yet some have raised a concern, are we sure we want to privatize censorship? Do we want to use these private for-profit corporations to be the censors as to what is acceptable and what isn't acceptable? And I was wondering if you had some thoughts on that, Petra.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good question. I think that gets at a broader set of considerations around the privatization of this space generally, and the fact that we have become so comfortable with the growing role of the private sector in censorship, but also in surveillance, and increasingly in this opaque space of decision-making where we move through the world and we're not even really aware of the incursion of the private sector on our daily lives. And the problem is, you know, not to keep bringing in the legal perspective, but that's
okay. That's what you do.
I guess I am the lawyer on the panel. The difference is that, like, when you're looking at, for example, public decision-making versus private decision-making, different responsibilities accrue to a public entity as opposed to a private entity. And sometimes what we see is this kind of responsibility laundering that happens, or passing the hot potato back and forth if something goes wrong. And it's very easy in these public-private partnerships sometimes to say, well, you know, it's not our problem, it should be the private sector. The private sector will say, well, not our problem because intellectual property, or a variety of different corporate shields. And then the issue is that accountability and oversight, and even just mechanisms of appeal, become pretty impossible if you can't really pin the responsibility down on anybody. And when we're also dealing with these massive juggernaut corporations that also have all sorts of subsidiaries that, you know, most of us are not even really aware of unless you study this, you know, for your job. It's very hard to understand the web of ways that this is all connected. And also geopolitically too, right? We have to move away, I think, from looking at it from specific kind of country profiles. This is like a broad net that covers the entire world. It's really, really difficult to try and figure out the role of the private sector and how to keep them accountable.
Well, I mean, Brendan and Matt, you both work for PEN, which is concerned about censorship and so forth. Have you, either of you, or I mean, you both can comment, dealt with the issue of this call for these private giant corporations to be the vehicles deciding what can be circulated and what can't? And if they aren't appropriate, how do we deal with it?
I'm happy to go first. I think we talked about this before, that Mark Zuckerberg said that Facebook should not be the arbiter of truth. But that's, of course, complete nonsense, because it already is. It's just not doing that in a transparent and responsible way. Because when your algorithm is deciding what is being disseminated, it has become de facto the arbiter of truth. So I think what the current sort of regulatory dance is to work out where is the sweet spot between the profit model that has enabled the rapid rise of these platforms and something that approaches accountability. And it's not going to be a simple fix, because they all have a different personality. They all have different algorithms and interests. So it's going to require quite a lot of sophistication. I mean, there's this fascinating exercise that Facebook undertook recently to create a constitution, and they put a huge amount of money into it. And one of the people they had as a senior consultant was Albie Sachs from South Africa. Now, if you look at the speed at which the South African overhauled their constitution, they moved through every little detail. And these companies are used to doing things at a breakneck speed. So now they have 1 billion people on board. It's, you know, very late in the day to start looking at a Facebook constitution, a board to review, and to suddenly import all the ethics that you disregarded during your meteoric rise. But that's where we're at, I think.
Matt, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the Facebook High Court is a great example, and the Special Rapporteur, David Kay, did a great piece on this, and he essentially said, like, look, this looks a lot like Facebook is becoming like government, and there's probably a lot of reasons why we don't want that. He made his points better than I'll be able to here, but one of the reasons is it's kind of a false mimesis, that it looks like a government, it smells like government, but in fact its incentives and its accountability structures are almost diametrically opposed or different than actual government, including the fact that we don't get to vote. You know, we're sort of constituents in a non-democracy as Facebook users, or even as Facebook non-users. Mm-hmm. The cautionary tale here is that there have been attempts to legislate around the world. Germany, a number of the proposals that were floated here in the United States last week related to Section 230 reform that essentially say, like, yo, platforms, clean up your house, like, get your house in order. And when you do that, there's a lot of different variations that we could go to. We could have a whole technocratic discussion here. But that basic sort of creation of a legal set of incentives or mandate to take on that task of comprehensive content moderation is hugely problematic as well. So you have this hugely problematic, the house is on fire, women, people of color, marginalized communities around the world are getting harassed off of the internet, which is increasingly critical infrastructure for, like, life. So the present conditions are totally unacceptable and are not situations in which most people can express themselves freely. An equally bad, but in a different way, scenario is one in which we set up these private companies without any real accountability structure to the public to do comprehensive remediation of that situation, because we know that what happens is that those same communities will be over-moderated. More of their content that was appropriate will actually be pulled down. Dissenting speech describing troubling things in a society will be pulled down. And so, you know, like Brendan says, it's a hugely complex, it's like hugely urgent and hugely complex, which is a really, really bad combination, but it's the world that we find ourselves in.
Back a while in the discussion, Brendan, you were introducing another aspect of what we could deal with in terms of data portability. I'd like to come back to that. Do you want to just describe briefly what
I think it's one of the ways. Concept? It's one of the ways you could rapidly realign the relationship between the platforms and the users. Currently, it's a very asymmetric relationship in terms of knowledge. They know an enormous amount about us, and we know very little about how they are feeding us. If you had control over your data and you could take it all with you, they would then face the prospect of very rapidly losing their assets. And there's nothing that would make them pay attention more carefully than that. So if you wanted to create, one of the problems is that sort of the monopoly problem, this would go some way towards breaking that. This would be a sort of consumer antitrust initiative, because people would immediately spring up who treated your data more respectfully. And that would, I think, go much further than a government could or a constitution could to reforming these practices. And it would realign the relationship to some degree. It was Maria Ressa who brought it to my attention. And obviously she's at the sharp end of these things. So she's thought about it quite carefully.
Petra, did you have any thoughts on greater data portability and individual data ownership?
Lots of thoughts. Well, I mean, it's definitely, I guess maybe I'll just bring in the perspective of also data literacy, which is something we haven't really talked about, and the kind of individualized way that we need to think about education when it comes to, you know, how we move through the world and how our data is used. Because I mean, more and more people are becoming aware of some of these problems we've been discussing here today, but in terms of data ownership and even the ability, for example, to opt out of data collection, that's something that I think a lot of people in certain communities are not really engaging with. I mean, jurisdictionally, it's, for example, different in Europe, right? Because they have the General Data Protection Regulation or the GDPR, and data ownership and all sorts of different remedies that come with that are a little bit more, I think, talked about. But even, you know, we don't have to look at it from a legal perspective, but even just something simple as how do you meaningfully consent to your data being stored and shared and used for a variety of different purposes that you might not be aware of. We're seeing that increasingly in these really problematic uses, for example, at the border, or where data is collected for you, but you don't really have an opportunity to say no. If you're a refugee in a camp and it's a choice between having your retina scanned or eating that week, I mean, that's not really a choice, right? And these power hierarchies that are inherent in data collection and data use that we really need to be aware of.
If I could just jump in there, Jim. Very early on, Matt mentioned the acquisition of Nest, the thermostat. And in Shoshana Zuboff's book, she mentions that University of London researchers looked at the end user license agreement for Nest, and they unpicked it, and they worked out that in order to meaningfully consent to its provisions, you would have to review 1,000 separate contracts. So that gives you an idea of how much this data is being pulled in different directions and how complex it would be to just manage it and you know, oversee it ethically. And these companies have simply glossed over it, and you know, you click here. How can anyone meaningfully consent to 1,000 separate contracts for a thermostat? Can you imagine what your phone is doing?
Matt, did you have anything you wanted to add on this? Before we're going to turn to the audience in a minute.
Yeah. Well, just it's another tangent that I won't go into too much, but I just love it, and I bring it up anytime I can. This idea of weaponized boredom. So there's the question of power differentials, like in a refugee camp where you're sort of being coerced into providing consent for your data. And there's also the question of kind of the social layer, maybe not with Nest as much, but with Facebook. You kind of have to, in most places in the world, you kind of have to consent. Otherwise, you're facing a very high social cost, right? Mm-hmm. But these huge terms and conditions documents, these legalistic documents that people are just clicking through, are an example of weaponized boredom, in the sense that it's just, even given the time that you might be able to read such a thing, it's just terrible. And these are kind of some of the techniques that are being used to manufacture consent, I think, maybe to your point.
Or compel, I mean, effectively compel consent, because it really is almost impossible to sort them out. I suspect almost all of us do what I do. As you see it, you just accept it and move on. But it makes a mockery of any genuine notion of consent.
And just the final thought I would have, I mean, the flip side of that, and I think Petra started to say something like this, is that some of the legislation, you can have one conversation about, like, is it the ideal balance? Does it set up the right mix of regulation and freedom for the marketplace, free expression, or the right incentive structures? But one of the really positive other or secondary benefits of things like GDPR has been that it's started a massive like popular conversation about data. It's like, what is this GDPR thing? I don't know. My uncle says it's terrible and XYZ. So it's, you know, we're certainly not there on data literacy by any stretch of the imagination, but I think it's been hugely powerful, not just in Europe, but around the world in driving people to say like, why did they bother to create this like kind of burdensome, complex legislation? What does it mean? Why would they care? What does it mean in terms of my rights? So I think it's a small glimmer of hope.
Well, let me turn to the audience for see if there are some questions. Ange, do you have a question that's come in from somebody in the audience?
Yeah, the first question is from Anne, and Anne says, Anne would love to hear the panelists' thoughts about the Google Smart City meltdown that happened in Toronto.
Okay, is any of you wanting to take on that one?
Canadians first, by all means.
Okay, I can start. I'll start on this one. I mean, I think it's such an interesting example of how a project was mismanaged from the beginning and how public knowledge and public participation in decision-making around a new neighborhood really was left off completely to the sidelines. And if you look at kind of the history of this project, it was kind of mired with problems from the very beginning, precisely because, you know, it was this rush to innovate, this rush to make ourselves available to, you know, this kind of sexy project that would put us on the world map. And yet variety of communities, people that were concerned, you know, different stakeholders were really not invited into the conversation space at all. And then, you know, if you kind of look at how it eventually devolved, a lot of it had to do with the fact, again, that it was not about meaningful public participation. It wasn't transparent. A lot of the decisions that were made were not accountable, and there was very little oversight. And if anything, it was perhaps a microcosm of some of these broader conversations that we're having globally about what does innovation look like? Who gets to participate in the conversations of what our cities look like? Who can opt out of surveillance? And are we comfortable with inviting a subsidiary of Google to build up an entire neighborhood in a multicultural, diverse city like Toronto?
I would only add to that Amazon had a very similar experience where they were dangling the second headquarters in front of various cities. And you saw again the asymmetrical relationship, because they were able to claim access to just troves of data that are very valuable from a civic perspective for free. And what happened to this data, just like with the carding database, are they going to keep it? Will they ever use it? None of this, there's so little oversight on these decisions. I mean, the history of these companies is that under the guise of communication and freedom of expression, they have laid claim to digital assets that we can no longer claw back from them. And that the phase we're in now is to work out, is it possible to get it back? And initiatives like this highlight that problem.
Matt, did you, from an American point of view, make a comment?
Sorry. I think, you know, and again, I think Petra may have made reference to this, like there's this question of how these systems, these kind of expert systems, smart cities systems, but also any other sort of like expert tool ends up de-skilling the people who are formally doing the work. And when you apply that in a smart cities context or an automation context, a civic context like that, the question is, who is this tool learning from and then de-skilling? And, you know, if we think about civic participation, how do we optimize a city? How do we optimize a democratic city? The way that we traditionally do that is contention and ideally inclusive debate. And we have fora and we have participatory budgeting, if we're really lucky. All of these processes that surface our collective wisdom. And so I think, you know, what people, I think smart cities is like in the process of jumping the shark right now. Mm-hmm. And it's because people are starting to realize that promise of like, we'll be on the map economically and then we'll just be like a future city and everything will be wonderful, comes at like a really high transactional cost, not just in terms of privacy, but in terms of the know-how of the city to govern itself. You're sort of handing over the keys and saying, I don't think I want to drive anymore.
I mean, all those things are true. This is an area in which the Center for Free Expression has been doing a great deal of work. And yet I'm not sure any of those lessons have been learned. When you look at the response of most of the politicians in Toronto after Sidewalk Labs left, and for those who don't know, Sidewalk Labs is an affiliate of Google and part of Alphabet. So it was really Alphabet, Google's parent, buying into access to all these data and using Toronto as a testing ground for expanding its work in this area. The response from most of the politicians has been, oh my God, we got to find somebody else to do what they were going to do. It's as if there were no lessons learned from that. And even the terminology smart cities is so misleading, as if embracing uncritically the technology makes you smart. And if it only applies to cities. I mean, in our work, we're now referring to it as connected communities. Connection can be in non-technological ways, and so there's a whole bunch of issues here. And if any of our listeners are interested, please go to the center's website, because this is an area in which we're doing a lot of work. And could we go to the second question?
Yeah, so the next question is from David, and David says, I have a concern about the long-term effects of these platforms, or if not solely of them, accelerated by them, in the way in which discussions or debates seem increasingly being reduced to simply opposing assertions. Trump is an example. I thought he would be a good source of poor arguments to teach critical thinking with. He isn't. He never gives reasons, but only asserts. Can the panelists comment on that?
Well, I think we could spend another hour on that. That ties in so many different problems. It comes back to the splintering of information, I think. So, for example, very complex debates about the police in America. There are 18,000 police forces. They don't have a standard way of being trained and so on. All of that is being shunted to one side in a whole section of the Twitterverse, because they believe that George Floyd would have died from a fentanyl overdose because he had so much fentanyl. So we have a situation in which facts shut down any further discussion, and it paints the other side as in bad faith. So I think we have platforms in which people are kind of fighting to the death over details, and very, very few people are looking at the larger question. I mean, right here, the DeFonte Miller verdict just came in. It's a 63-page verdict, which is well worth reading. And the way it was reduced online to this, or one very simple reading of this is what the judge said about the police. He didn't. He said 63 pages of very nuanced legal reasoning. But the way we consume the news pushes us into these encampments where that wasn't good enough, more needs to be done, or yes, it was big. So we're now in different universes. And I think Trump is merely the top of the food chain there. So he doesn't need to explain. He just asserts, and the platform assists him. So we can't blame him. We have to blame the way it's designed, I think.
Well, I think we can blame him a little bit, maybe. But if I can just add, I mean, I think it's also a philosophical question around, which assumptions are taking into account and which assumptions become fact. And this kind of gets at what we were talking about earlier when it comes to the changing nature of decision making and how we understand how decisions are made in this space, right? And which assumptions become the truth about you as you're progressing through the world and interacting with these systems. So in my work, for example, one egregious example I like to bring up is the use of these kind of AI-powered lie detectors at the border. It's a pilot project that was introduced in Europe, and the idea is that you're going to be interacting with an AI-based system, and based on your facial features and your facial recognition, the system is going to make an assumption about whether or not you're more likely to be telling the truth about your immigration journey. What kind of assumptions can we imagine that the system might use, right? we can all imagine which communities are going to be put into the category of more likely than not liars versus not, right? And again, it's this kind of I don't know, maybe it's part of a human nature, right? But we want to take really complex, messy, gray areas and make them into intelligible boxes that then are used for decision making. And immigration decisions are already incredibly opaque and discretionary. Same with certain issues in criminal justice. And these tools are only really creating this kind of false black and white narrative that does not actually accord, you know, to the messy daily human reality. And the concern is that really this is what we're seeing, not only on these platforms, but broader in the ecosystem of this kind of techno-solutionism that we're constantly seeing across the world.
Matt, did you have a comment?
Just a quick one. I agree with all of that. I mean, I think, you know, one of the interesting things is we don't fully understand why that's the case. And I mean, I don't know, like I saw another study in addition to the Reuters Oxford study that I mentioned earlier this week that said, it suggested that in some cases people are clicking on messages that might include disinformation that kind of map to their worldview already because it's comforting. So it's sort of like confirmation bias as a palliative like habit relative to just the anxious times we live in. So less that people are clicking because they're part of an outrage engine, and more that they're clicking because they're part of like almost like an anti-outrage engine, an insulation engine. I don't know if that's true or if it's, you know, universally true, but I think, you know, there's just a lot of study that we need to do in addition to these other issues of accountability and transparency to really understand, like, what is the psychology here? I mean, a lot of the work that PEN America does on this, while we wait the scientific findings of exactly why social media is a problem, is really on the media literacy side. So if people are interested, we have a recent report out on how to protect yourself from disinformation online during the protests. And I think it's useful for the exact thing that it describes itself as, but it's also a good introduction to essentially like inoculation. So the idea of like, how do you kind of arm yourself to be a better citizen in the public sphere in 2020? How do you make sure that you're not somebody who's retransmitting disinformation and turning it into misinformation? And so I think we need a lot of education in addition to whatever needs to happen on the platforms. We need a lot of like a new ethos and a lot of just know-how for everybody.
So if I could just add one thing
yes,
there,
please.
Jim. The Facebook mantra in the early days was move fast and break things. And that's an almost perfect description of what democracy shouldn't be. A deliberative democracy is something that's meant to absorb complexity, wrangle over it at a certain speed. And I think that this is the reason that we've embraced systems that move at illiberal, there's a systemic illiberalism in these platforms, because we're being encouraged to treat the world emotionally, because it is coming at us in a never-ending stream of emotional factoids or provocative factoids. So it's very hard when you can't drink yourself sober, and this is what we're trying to do. Having more of this is not going to make us more democratic. Having it in a different form gives us a chance. But at the moment, we've embraced these techno-solutionism approaches, and we're sort of, there's regulatory capture that's preventing us from seeing an alternative.
Matt, I wanted to pick up on one thing. You were talking about the initiative of PEN America to increase people's awareness of it. Another response, I mean, that's part of a response that others have suggested as to how we deal with the disruptive nature of platforms, and that is to figure out ways to strengthen institutions that engage in the independent pursuit of accurate information about what's happening in the world, and that generate serious and meaningful knowledge, and make that knowledge available to the public. And that's why I think there's a variety of initiatives looking at what we can do to promote independent journalism and investigative journalism at a time when their model, their business model has been demolished by Facebook and Google. It absorbs 60 or 70 or 80% of all the advertising dollars, but also what supportive universities and public libraries and museums and other sources of information can do. That's a whole other way of beginning to address some of the issues that we've been talking about. Could we go back to Ange to another question if you have one?
Yeah, there's next question is from an anonymous attendee. And they say, I found study of the ancient field rhetoric is useful in parsing what's coming down the pipe, so to speak, especially in our age where STEM fields are crowding out or downright delegitimizing such artistic approaches, as Kenneth Burke might have put it, that have an irreplaceable role to play. Any thoughts, comments from the panelists?
I have to say, you must be the first commenter in internet history to invoke Kenneth Burke. Good for you. But yeah, well, there's been an impoverishment at many levels. Some of it goes back to the speed at which we're consuming these things. But just to return to the purely sort of free speech parts of it, we're really shifted from an economy of information into an attention economy. And the differences between those two is perhaps more important than the rhetoric that you use, because you can shut down a whole sections of the population from paying attention to something purely by tweaking these systems, so that it doesn't matter how well something is said or how complex. If it's not seen, it's the tree falling in the forest. I'll give you a very simple example. Hassan Minhaj on Patriot Act just did a piece on TurboTax, and it has two separate websites, one in which you could file for free, and then one which drives you to its paying products. And no prizes for guessing which one is almost impossible to find on a search engine and which one pops up immediately. And so this is a systemic problem. And it doesn't matter what's at the other end if you never get to the other end. If you can't find it, it doesn't exist. So I think that sort of silence is more important.
Matt or Petra?
Oh, sure. I guess the other thing to think about, though, is also with this question, when you were asking, about the overcrowding of STEM and what about other perspectives, is the importance of interdisciplinary conversations and bringing in other perspectives when we're talking about data, technology, techno-solutionism, and these kind of platforms. And, as someone who tries to work in an interdisciplinary way, I always like to think, like, what about the artists? What about the poets? What about all these other disciplines and worldviews and indigenous traditions, for example? Like, why aren't people like that part of the conversation when it comes to, what we want our world to look like? And I think in your question, you rightly say, there's all these other modalities and different ways of looking at the world that can be helpful and important, besides this kind of like very clinical, STEM engineering driven worldview. And in my work, I come across that actually quite a bit, because I only very recently started working on this intersection between technology and immigration and human rights. And now that I work on issues like this, I oftentimes am in rooms with engineers and data scientists and people who are very squarely kind of in that very objective, scientific, quote unquote, or quote unquote objective also, way of looking at the world. And my job sometimes is to be like, well, but what about all these other things? Have you ever been to a criminal court? Have you ever been to a refugee camp? Mm-hmm. Have you read poetry about, this kind of stuff? And they don't seem to value that because they've been trained in a very specific way. Everything is objective, everything is measurable, everything is black and white. But as hopefully we've been discussing during this conversation, obviously the world doesn't work that way. But technology amplifies these really problematic ways of looking at it. That's why we need diversity of disciplines, but also of lived experiences in this conversation.
I guess, the comment I'd make, and it's maybe a qualification, or maybe I misheard what you said. I don't think it's technology that does that. I think it's how we design the technology. I think the point here is that Facebook and Twitter have been designed in a way that does the very things you described. I don't think that's inherent in the technology. I think it's designed into it to achieve the commercial and other objectives of the designers. I don't know if you think that's a fair comment.
I would say two things to that, Jim. All of these systems, whenever you read engineers describing them, they talk about frictionlessness. And friction is when your opinion is countered by exactly the sorts of voices that you're not hearing. So the less of that, the less noise in the system, the faster it moves. And if you have a commercial imperative in your algorithm, it also has an interest in market segmentation. So it will pry little differences into wider differences, the better to target the psychographic profiles and so on. So systemically, it is, I agree, it's neutral, but it's been optimized very deliberately to shut down certain points of view.
No, but I mean, that's what I was trying to say. I think it is designed into the way the technology to serve the purposes of the owners of the technology and their objectives. It's not designed in order to facilitate contemplative discussion, reflection, adding complexity. It's designed to move quickly and, as you say, frictionlessly. Matt, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was going to give Matt a chance to respond to the question that we were spinning off on.
All of that's brilliant. I mean, I think the question, and I, much love to the Kenneth Burke reference from my end as well. I think it was a brilliant question because these spaces, both the space of a platform like Facebook or Twitter, meaning its user experience, not just the content that you're running into, and also the space in which we're having this discourse about these platforms is incredibly rhetorical, incredibly over-determined and kind of crafted by different histories, including, sort of deliberate corporate rhetoric, but also the history of democracy, the history of the subject and the object. Let's call it, I have not read this for 10 years, so forgive me if I misquote. Andy Clark has an essay in a book called Natural Born Cyborg, who I believe this actually draws on Kenneth Burke. So I'll find out afterwards if I was wrong. But basically, he's really interested in the ways that Western civilization primarily has distinguished the tool or the technos from the self, and the ways in which modern cognitive science are showing that that's actually in some ways not true. If you have a favorite pen or keyboard that you're very accustomed to use, or if you're a cyclist and you are sort of integrated with your bike because you've used it so much, you actually view that technology cognitively as part of yourself. You can almost sense where the end of the pencil is. If you pick up an object you're not used to, you don't. So there's a way that these technologies integrate themselves, or we integrate ourselves into them. And the reason I bring that up is partially just because it's cool, but also because this brings us over to the question of, like, how does that not fit with how we think about ourselves online and who we are as subjects of Facebook or Twitter? How does it not fit with the experience of the refugee who's being confronted by technology that's being done to them? And finally, it reminds me of, there's just like this incredible sort of almost utopian line of critical theory that I think we all have to resuscitate somehow. Donna Haraway, radical eco-feminist, who talks about the inseparability of ourselves from technology, cyborg feminism. And, these are the types of spaces that we should be trying to create rhetorically as we confront, like, why is social media so bad? Not just because we got zucked or however you want to frame it.
Well, listen, thank you very much. We're almost at the end. Given the complexity of this and so many things we could have addressed, I'm sure all of you are feeling that you only got to address a couple things. If you have a minute or so just to share a concluding comment or reflection, perhaps we can just go in reverse order from which we began. Petra?
Sure. I mean, I guess my concluding comment would be to really try and tease apart this kind of hubris of big tech and thinking that it has all the answers. And I know we haven't talked a lot about COVID here, and I don't want to do that artificial thing that everyone is doing now where they're trying to shove their work into the COVID reality. But I think it is instructive because, over the last few months, we've seen this incredible kind of obsession with quick fixes, right? And figuring out, how do we track this pandemic? What do we do? And in my work too, I mean, with migration control, we see the same thing. And yet these quick fixes and these band-aid solutions that are presented as this glorious panacea by the big tech, really, they don't get at the structural problems that are intractable and difficult and ones we've been grappling with for millennia or centuries. And really, again, it's this hubris of the private sector that they know all the answers, that they've decided that they are the value holders of society. I think that's something we need to really push against and problematize and ask who is at the table and who gets to participate in the world making that we're all collectively engaged in.
Thank you. Brendan?
I'm still stuck on the Kenneth Burke question. I have to say, Shoshana Zuboff is very illuminating on the proclamation side of the digital companies, that they behave very much like the conquistadores. They arrive early in the ecosystem and realize no one has really claimed data exhaust or behavioral cognitive surplus or behavioral surplus, and they merely stake out a claim. And this claim is a rhetorical claim, which becomes over time a political and a legal claim. So reclaiming that is our duty as citizens, as civil society. And I think the other book that came to mind was this fantastic book about post-conflict resolution. And we are in a conflict, don't be fooled. By John Paul Lederach. It was called The Moral Imagination. And he tried to show that in post-conflict societies, you had to have voices in the room that were the most frictionable possible voices. So you can't make a lasting peace with your friends. It's got to be with your enemies. It's got to be with people who have been completely forgotten by your designers. And the hubris of Facebook, Twitter, Google is that we're smart enough to design for everyone. And now that it's, we've grown too quickly and the whole system is creaking, we are the only ones who can fix it. This is just simply wrong. And people need to push back against it more.
Thank you very much. Matt?
Oh, Lord. Summing up a whole conversation over an hour and a half, ranging from Kenneth Burke to refugee iris scans. I don't know if I have anything really profound to add other than I think I and as PEN America, we're just very suspicious of any quick fixes or anything that looks like a slogan. These, as I said earlier, these problems are incredibly complex and incredibly urgent, but we have this really, really special thing in the history of civilization called free expression. And, I think we sort of compromise that at our peril. And so I think the sad fact is that we're going to have to really, really deepen the conversation before we can figure out what a right solution looks like and not a really destructive solution looks like.
Well, I want to thank all three of you for a really stimulating discussion. And I'd like to thank our audience for participating and for your questions, which obviously stimulated our panelists and their responses. So this is the final of the Center for Free Expression Virtual Forum series for the spring. We'll be beginning again in September. And if you want to see what those will be, they'll be posted on our website over the next few weeks. It's CFE for Center for Free Expression.ryerson.ca. Thank you very much for attending this discussion. Bye-bye.